Chapter 14. As hours pass, Jeremy sits all alone in a cold concrete cell, staring at the floor, hoping the words Detective Burt released in the interrogation room were untrue. Over and over again, he tries his hardest to convince himself that it was all nothing but lies and that AJ is not dead. That it was only something the man said to get an emotional response out of him. No matter how hard he tries, however, Jeremy cannot seem to get himself to believe AJ is still among the living. Deep down, he can somehow feel his best friend's absence from this world. Like somehow, in the back of his mind, he had already known that this is somehow the reason he did not allow himself to go to school today. It has been much time since his tears have stopped flowing. Hours have passed in this windowless and lonely cell, and his weeping has turned his eyes to deserts. Looking through his cell bars and into the silence of the nearby empty holding area, he feels alone. His only companion is the guard who has been sitting silently behind his desk, playing something noisy and annoying on his phone. Jeremy has yet to see anything but the man's fingertips and the soles of his shoes since he arrived in his cell. When he looks at the ground, though, there is still a puddle sitting below his laceless feet, still holding his eyes staring back at him. The ripples have all ceased, and he can barely make out his own translucent reflection. Disgusted, he reaches down and swipes at the liquid mirror with his hands, sending its millions of molecules into utter chaos. His reflection distorts, and he brings his hands back up to cover his face. His left ear twitches when he hears the approach of his mother and an unknown man from down the hall beyond the holding area. Lifting his head, he again peers through the bars holding him within the cage. However, this time, he's focused at the door on the far end of the holding area. As they close in on the holding room, Jeremy cannot help but feel a little worried that he has no excitement to have visitors. This seems to be the case, especially for his mother. He could do without her judgment at this time. Keys jingle from the other side of the door as Jeremy hears an unfamiliar voice apologize to his mother. After a couple more attempts to unlock the door, there is finally success as the door swings open with a long, droning squeal. 3 figures pass through the door, connecting the rest of the precinct with this holding room. His mother and one of the 2 men with her walk up to the guard's desk as one stays behind to guard the doorway, it seems. The one who stays behind is an officer who Jeremy happened to see on his way toward the interrogation room, who wears a generic police uniform. Jeremy's mother is now standing next to the very tall and thin man in a dark blue suit with a matching tie and a white shirt. This man is still a mystery to Jeremy, and is quite bald, clean-shaven, and holds multiple folders under his right arm. The tall man looks toward Jeremy in his cell and smiles, pulling his wrinkly face to an upward curve. After pausing his mystery game and placing his phone in his pocket, the guard gets a nod from the officer at the door, who then leaves the room and locks the door behind him. The guard on duty stands up to greet the tall man and Jeremy's mother. His proportions almost comically opposing those of the man in the suit. Short and quite round, he wears the same unoriginal police uniform as the other officer of a light blue shirt and dark slacks. His hat rides low in the front, kissing the bridge of his nose. Now standing on the opposite side of the desk as Jeremy's mother and the tall man are standing, the tall man hands him some papers from one of the folders in his arm. There is some quiet talking between the 3 that Jeremy doesn't care to hear. Pulling a pen from one of the top drawers of his desk, the guard begins scribbling on the papers before handing them back to the tall man. Jeremy's mother stands there jittery, looking back and forth between the 2 men and back at Jeremy in the cell. A light mist of tears can be seen in her eyes as she has her arms folded tightly in front of her chest, and she just cannot keep her foot from tapping over and over again on the floor in anxiety. Alright, The guard begins loudly. "He is right over there." He continues as he raises his finger to point in Jeremy's direction. Jeremy cannot help but thinking this man is an idiot, because he is the sole person and the only occupied holding cell in the room. The other two did not really need him to be pointed out. "Oh, Jeremy!" He hears his mother call as she comes rushing to the cell door. She places her hands on the cold bars and Jeremy can see the tears in her eyes begin to run down her face. He knows she wants him to rush to her as well, but he finds himself with no urge to do so. "Are you all right?" she asks, as she squeezes the bars in a much tighter fashion and waits for the two men to reach her position to release her son. "Unlock these doors. He is a minor and will be released into our custody," the tall man bellows to the guard, who is trailing him by a few steps. This guard is taking his time and appears to be in no rush to release Jeremy. Something that puzzles him, since he has done nothing to cause this man any trouble at all. "You will be lucky if we don't press charges," the tall man continues. "Emotionally and physically assaulting a minor in your custody," the tall man scoffs. "I'll bet your mothers are so proud," he continues, badgering the guard as he continues on his way toward the cell door. The guard does as he's told, all the while shaking his head at the tall man's remarks. The tall man walks in through the open cell door and sits next to Jeremy on the cold concrete bench. Jeremy's confused look changes focus between his mother, who rushes up and hugs him, and then stands back, and the tall man nearly hip to hip with him. "Hello, Jeremy. I am Mr. Wiskin," the tall man introduces himself. "Your mother has hired me as your attorney. Do you understand of what it is they are accusing you?" the tall man asks. Jeremy looks at him, but says nothing. Wiskin looks back at Jeremy's mother and shakes his head with a frown. Then putting his attention back on Jeremy, he continues on. "Okay," Mr. Wiskin begins again, as he opens up one of the files and lets out a deep, heavy breath. "You are a suspect in the disappearance of Stephen Donis and the murders of Wilt Cannon and, Alan Salo." Jeremy's stomach retches as these words are spoken. Now, they don't have enough evidence to keep you here, and they are keeping the events of the interrogation room under wraps, so you are free to go. He continues on before he looks over at Jeremy, whose gaze has fallen to the again still puddle between his feet on the floor. "Looks like your bruised eye and that little bit of blood on your shirt are going to work in our favor for now." Mr. Wiskin smiles a weak smile at Jeremy. "His lip! Look at his lip!" Jeremy's mother says angrily as she gently grabs a hold of Jeremy's face and holds his fattened lip for Mr. Wiskin to see. Mr. Wiskin nods and quickly makes a note in his paperwork. "Do you understand what is going on now?" he asks Jeremy, who is still facing him, though his mother has released his face. "Yes, they think I killed my best friend," he answers Mr. Wiskin with an emotionless face. "Those idiots," Jeremy continues as he stands up. He walks over to the door and steps out of the cell. Stopping only for a second, he turns his head back slightly toward his mother and Mr. Wiskin. "I didn't do it," he says as he continues on down the hallway and waits by the door to be let free, leaving his mother and Mr. Wiskin behind in the cell. "Jeremy, we still have some things to go over," Mr. Wiskin calls out from the cell as he rises quickly to his feet and begins out of the cell after him. "Jeremy!" he calls out again. "Don't," Jeremy's mother says as she steps in front of Mr. Wiskin. "He just needs a little time. I'll call you when he's ready to talk," she tells Mr. Wiskin, who just nods and follows her to the door leading out of the room. They rush to the door of which Jeremy has already been allowed to pass through, and the officer from earlier stands waiting for the other two. Jeremy's mother catches up with him quickly in the hall and turns him around so she can wrap him in a tight embrace. They don't speak a word, just stay there for a moment as the precinct buzzes around them. Unbeknownst to his mother, Jeremy stands there not really enjoying the embrace. He just wishes to go home and sleep in his bed. "Don't worry," Mr. Wiskin says, reaching them a few moments later. They have absolutely no evidence that you have done anything at all. Jeremy releases himself from his mother's grip and looks Mr. Wiskin deep in his eyes. That's because I didn't do anything, Jeremy says as he leads Mr. Wiskin and his mother down the hall and out of the police station. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the story and how it's going, please subscribe so you can get every chapter as it comes through. Discuss in the comments, plot threads, and where you think the story's going. Share with anybody you think might find it interesting. Until then, I'll see you next video.